Welcome back to Logic. My name's Tom, and today we are going to talk about Lewis Carroll's What Achilles Said to the Tortoise. This is a somewhat difficult article, and to set it up, this unit moving forward till the end of the semester, we are going to be talking about ways in which to call into question the logical rules we just learned, and also talk about some different obstacles to reasoning well. Um, just to start off, um, there are lots of cases in which a person who is perfectly rational and very smart can have all of the salient facts in front of them and not make the right inference, right? Sometimes there are psychological factors, there are social factors, there are practical factors. People don't reason very well when they're tired or hungry. But also, there are more developed forms of things like self-deception, things like cognitive dissonance that we will talk about. But here, when we talk about Carroll's article, this is just about starting to talk about what it is to actually make the kind of inferences that we've been seeing in logic, with premises and a conclusion, and what it means to kind of go from those premises to a conclusion, and what happens when a person, has those premises and then doesn't get to the right conclusion, right? Because it happens all the time. um, uh, People see, smoking is bad for your health. If you smoke, then you're likely to die of, emphysema. Um, so I shouldn't smoke. And you think, well, but that's probably not going to happen to me, right? And so you just don't make it to the right conclusion there. And so we want to talk about that. And one thing to notice at this point, before I get into the actually Carroll's argument or specifically, is to notice that we've learned a lot of logical rules, right? We've learned modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism or elimination, depending on the term you want to use there, hypothetical syllogism, these things. And there's a great deal of intuitive pull when you see the examples. Usually, like in our book, it would say, this is the rule, this is an example, here's an example of how it doesn't work. And you think, okay, good. That makes sense. Or maybe it didn't make sense at first, and then you get enough examples and you're like, okay. Um, but what we don't get into, or we haven't gotten into, and that you won't see in pretty much any logic textbook, is justification for those rules. Why should we buy into modus ponens? Sure, it strikes me as fairly intuitive, but that's not really a good reason for thinking that it forms the basis of logic, right? Um, and so there's a question about why those logical rules are there and why we revere them as logical rules, as the logical forms of inference, right? Why is that sense of logic better than other senses of logic? And this is a topic in philosophy, right? Philosophy of logic. Um, and so, this article from Lewis Carroll is quite famous, and Carroll is obviously the individual who wrote Alice in Wonderland, and so he was a fairly serious logician, from what I understand. So, his argument is like this. Okay, um, look at modus ponens, right? Modus ponens. In my notes, I put if A, then B, A therefore B. That's the rule. You go from the two premises, if A, then B, and A, and given those premises, you can infer B, right? So in order to understand how that works, in order to understand that you need to, what you need to do to get to that, to infer that conclusion B, you need to know the rule of modus ponens, right? That given these two premises, you can infer this conclusion. Okay, so that means that given premise one and premise two, and you know that you have the rule modus ponens, then you can infer the conclusion, right? Okay, good. But then if that's the way modus ponens works, then it looks like you actually need a kind of further conditional, right? That if you have these kinds of premises and you have the rule modus ponens, then you can infer this conclusion. So now you have to kind of insert the rule of how you move from premises to conclusion, right? In order to get to your conclusion. And if that's the case, then it seems like you need to insert a further rule that tells you that given the rule modus ponens and the premises you have here, you know that you need to apply that rule to these premises to get to the conclusion. And so what happens is you end up getting more and more conditionals that you need to put into place to tell you that given these premises, you need to get to this conclusion. Given these premises and the rule, then you can get to this conclusion. And then given the premises and this rule, and the rule that you know that you should apply modus ponens, then you can get to your conclusion, right? And so the main takeaway from this is that is the question about, you know, why do we apply these rules, and how do we justify these rules? I mean, this opens up a whole line of inquiry where, you know, if you think something like modus ponens is a rule of logic, right, and you want to justify it, it means you're going to use logic to justify it. So you're probably going to use something like the rule of modus ponens to justify something like the rule of modus ponens. And so you're going to use the same logical rules to actually justify the logical rules you have. And so this becomes what appears to be a kind of circularity. But nonetheless, the the point here is that, you do need something like what Lewis Carroll's pointing out, right? You need something like the idea that you are going to apply modus ponens given if A then B and A, right? Given those two premises. Why? Well, you can have, like my smoking example, you can have those premises and not get your conclusion, right? So if I smoke, then I'll get COPD, right? I smoke, but I'm not going to get emphysema, right? We make those kinds of inferences all the time, and we don't make the inferences in the right sort of way, right? And you can do this same kind of principle for inductive reasoning, right? You have all this data that tells me that, I don't know, if I drive, 20 miles over the speed limit, my chances of getting in an accident are, go up by 50% or something like this. I'm making this up, but I'm really late, so I really don't care, right? And then we just don't make the inferences given the premises, right? So that's why you need this additional rule to tell you that really you should kind of be logical in your reasoning, and given these premises, you should infer this kind of conclusion. But then, if that's the question, then or if that's the answer, then the question is, well, why should I be logical, or why should I use these logical rules, or why should I endorse these logical rules? And so some students get a little bit frustrated at this idea because, the idea is that through the course we've learned a bunch of logical rules, and now it seems like I'm telling you that they're not worth anything. But that's not really the case. It's about, taking a more critical look at these rules, and really thinking a little bit more about logic and what it is to be logical and what it is to be rational, um, and looking at it in more of, this is all moving us towards looking at logic in a very applied sense. Moving forward, we'll look at some fallacies in reasoning, and as I said, we'll look at some different psychological dispositions and questions about our reasoning that present like obstacles to our reasoning, and to think about what it is to really apply something like modus ponens. And maybe there are cases where you might not want to, or maybe disjunctive syllogism is not really the right kind of rule to use in an inference, right? You might want to reject the disjunction at issue. We'll actually talk about what's called a false dilemma, right? Where you're getting given two, you kind of worked into a corner where you have two options, right? Like, a lot of students will talk about the current context with politics, that two-party system, you're either a Democrat or Republican, and some people find that to be a false dilemma. There are other options. You could be an independent, you could be part of the Green Party or something like this. And so, if you're given that, then you might think like something like a disjunctive syllogism is not the right sort of inference or rule to use there, because you actually reject the disjunction from which you would make that inference. So, um, there's lots of cases like this, cases where the kind of conditional statements of most opponents don't seem to apply quite right, or the rules around conjunction or disjunction don't seem to really match up with the way we use reasoning in our everyday context. So this is just to kind of get you thinking about this stuff. And good luck with the Carroll article. Do your best. Read with soft eyes. Try to get the main overall point. And I will be talking with you soon.